There's a quiz, and it begins. How many of you can name the 4 freedoms? And by the way, who spoke the 4 freedoms?
Roosevelt.
Okay, which Roosevelt? Make sure. Okay, and what are they?
Speech, religion, worship, far from fear. And fear.
We are honored, we of Americans United, all of us are honored to have with us the Medal of Freedom winner for freedom of worship from the Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt Institute this year, that was awarded just a few days ago in Hyde Park, New York, at Theodore and Eleanor's home. The CEO and the fire that ignites us all in the manning the wall between separation of church and state, our leader, Barry Lynn. Please welcome him.
Thank you very much for that. I was very honored by that award, and we're giving out some very important awards right here today. The freedom of religion in this country, the freedom to worship or to choose not to worship, is always kind of a fragile commodity. Even more so when you find this year at least 3 of the candidates for the nomination for president of one major political party all claim that God has chosen them to be the next president. And that those of you who are deeply mathematical know that statistically that means at least 2 of them are wrong, and there is the possibility they're all wrong. The founder of Americans United was himself a member of the very party I alluded to. He was a strong Republican political force and law school dean in the state of Kansas. But he gave up his very promising political career in order to come right here to Washington to spend the rest of his life in the cause of real religious freedom. He was concerned about religious influences in the public schools. He was concerned about efforts to subsidize private religious schools with tax dollars. He was worried about the censorship of books and of films based on theological critiques of those pieces of art. He became a close friend of Eleanor Roosevelt during his time here, because he was very impressed that in the process of her writing a weekly column, and even writing in the august pages of the Ladies' Home Journal, Eleanor Roosevelt took a strong stand for the separation of church and state. She often said that no public school should teach religion, and when she sent her own children to private schools, she wrote, "I never thought about seeking to ask the government to pay their tuition." Presciently, though, Mrs. Roosevelt told Glenn Archer once, "The battle for church-state separation may have to be fought all over again," that in the 1940s. And what we find, of course, in every generation, we continue to fight that battle over and over again. I think Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt, were they alive today, would be deeply disappointed by much of what they see in the atmosphere around the world, and particularly in regard to religious freedom in this country. I assume that they would be horrified that in a nation with 9% unemployment, a nation that cuts funding for history classes, civics classes, art and music in public schools, and is facing a crisis in medical care for the elderly that is unprecedented in our modern history, that somehow last Tuesday afternoon, the House of Representatives chose to take a break from those great issues in order to reaffirm their support for "In God We Trust" as the national motto of the United States. The national motto, of course, comes from that great founding fathers period of 1956. We had managed to get through, even without the words "under God" and the Pledge of Allegiance, had managed to get through 2 world wars and out of the Great Depression. Somehow, though, in the 50s, things changed. I think the Roosevelts would look at the whole political process today and see it poisoned by the corrosive effects that some religion seems to have on the greatest institutions of our communities. The schools, the judiciary, the social service net, all corroded by a kind of religion which claims to know all things and whose only disappointment is that it doesn't control all things. We're entering a campaign season where candidates already have routinely been asked to come to places like South Carolina and out to Iowa to go to political gatherings where preachers lead the discussions and ask them to reveal not only their political views, but their personal piety as well, something that does a great disservice to the whole principle right in the so-called original Constitution that there will be no religious test for public office. Every issue from reproductive choice to the national debt has advocates drawing from scriptural tradition instead of critical thinking and sound analysis of data, and yes, even the commonly shared values of no holy book, but of the United States Constitution. Judges are being removed from office for making unpopular decisions. The Tea Party has discovered a whole new form of the United States Constitution in a sock drawer somewhere. And that Constitution preserves corporate power and displaces the conscience of the very individuals who make up America. Our schools face a double assault, forcing religious indoctrination into the curriculum, into the activities of public schools by some who treat the public schools as a kind of mission field for their own advocacy and ideology. And there also are people who, if that fails, seek to really rid America of the great tradition of public education and move everything back into private religious education, using school vouchers, tuition tax credits, and all kinds of other schemes. The late Jerry Falwell, whom I debated hundreds of times around the country and on radio and television, once indicated that he hoped he would live to see the day when there were no more public schools left in America. In the social service arena, President Roosevelt, in June of 1941, signed the first executive order barring discrimination in employment by government contractors and government grantees based on race, creed, color, or national origin, 1941. Regrettably, the Bush administration altered that to permit religious charities who are recipients of government contracts or funding to discriminate in the hiring of persons to do work in those charities, to give religious preference to those who felt like they did. This, unfortunately, is a practice continued in the Barack Obama administration. And groups justify this kind of hiring bias in some very peculiar ways. They say things like, we feel more comfortable working with people who are like us. In the case of the group World Vision, which received 300 million of your tax dollars last year, they proclaim that if they tell people applying for jobs that they only hire Christians, which is their policy, that is not discrimination. Said one of its officials, if we tell them in advance that we won't hire them, that's not discrimination. Does this sound like, Ms. Parks, we told you when you bought the bus ticket that you have to sit in the back of the bus, so please don't go telling us we're discriminatory. For 63 years, Americans United has tried to be faithful to what John F. Kennedy said in 1960 when he called for a complete separation of church and state. The so-called religious right over that time has sought to reduce or eliminate the reproductive choice rights of American women, or to seriously curtail them if abolition doesn't fail. The religious right has argued that the freedom of conscience must be preserved for institutions over those that they serve. The federal government considers a constitutional amendment to declare that marriage throughout America will be one man and one woman. We have, over the course of decades, taken the positions that make it clear that we understand that at roots so many of the great social issues of our time are really church-state issues. They're questions of whether we will live in a country that imposes a religious doctrine to make decisions on some of the most private and intimate matters that one can imagine. We were the people who sued on behalf of a number of veterans, including a tremendous woman named Roberta Stewart, whose husband was killed in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan. She and he were both Wiccans, pagans, and they would not and could not get the Veterans Administration for over 10 years to grant them the right to put on a memorial marker in a Nevada cemetery a pentacle, the holy, sacred symbol of the Wiccan and pagan community. It took a lawsuit from us to expose the real reason for their opposition for doing this, and that is that the VA said the president at that time, Commander-in-Chief George W. Bush, had once said on television that he didn't think pagans and Wiccans were practicing a real religion, and they didn't want to run counter to their Commander-in-Chief. We do all of this with the support of about 80,000 Americans who give generously and actively work for us in chapters all over the country. We have members who are Republicans and Democrats and independents, but all they are asked to do when they are a member of this organization is to declare their allegiance to the words, the practice, the principles of people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and Andrew Jackson and even Ulysses S. Grant, and of Jack Kennedy, that man who said we should have a complete separation of church and state in America. Many of you are not members of Americans United at this time. You're here, among other reasons, for the awards that are going to be given today, but I would heartily recommend and urge you and encourage you to join with us and those other 80,000 Americans who are committed to making sure that the Constitution is a viable Constitution and that separation of church and state and the religious freedom that it embodies is preserved for our children and for our grandchildren. So I know you've got little envelopes, so when I say I hope you'll join us, I literally mean I hope you will join us and become a member now or when you go home. Again, I thank you very much for coming. I'm looking forward to the program, and I'd like to bring back John Suarez, who is, of course, the head, the chair of our education committee that makes these lunches possible. Thank you.